Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. It is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Thank you for joining me again. Thank you for being here with me on another Friday to learn more about women of the Bible. And this week it is the turn for Sarah. If you watched the video last week, we talked about Hagar. And we included Sarah in her story because she is involved in her story greatly. And now we're going to talk about Sarah. So let's move you along a little bit over here. Okay. So this is Sarah. And like I said, if you want a copy of this Bible study, I can send you the link of the PDF file. It's for you to print for free. Okay, so Sarah. Let's start with Sarah. Caleb. Yes, let me preface this by telling you that I am doing homeschool at the same time that I'm doing this. My son is actively just copying a paper draft, a writing assignment. So he doesn't need me for the moment. So I'm going to record this. Okay, so Sarah, let's start with our first page here. Sarah, the mother of the Israelites, is such a fascinating person. She goes along with some pretty big changes that Abraham makes to their lives. Moving across country was a very big deal back then. I mean, I think it would still be a very big deal to move across country. I did that once, and it was a huge, several times actually. It is a big deal, but when you don't have a choice, you don't have a choice, right? She was with Abraham all through his history, and saw his faith waver, grow, and waver again. Walked alongside him as they grew from a small band to a great one that was big enough to need to make treaties with kings along the way. She gets treated badly sometimes and mistreats others. But she's still recognized in the Hebrew Hall of Faith, so there must be a few lessons from the life of Sarah in the Bible that we can still learn and apply today. And I think there is, I think just following her husband, being submissive to her husband, and just doing what he says. And I'm not saying that women need to be slaves but I think women do need to be obedient to their husbands, especially if you know that God directly is talking to your husband and telling him what to do. So let's walk along with Sarah and Abraham and their family and see what we can discover that would influence our lives. This is the story of Sarah in the Bible. So who was Sarah in the Bible? She was a wife of Abraham and also his half-sister, which wasn't a big deal back then. She holds a special place in the genealogy of faith. And despite her failures, God saw her and intervened on her behalf very specifically and more than once. The story of Sarah in the Bible begins in Genesis 11. Sometime after the Tower of Babel and the confusion of languages. We must meet her as Sarai, because that was her initial name before God changed her name to Sarah. A barren woman over 60. We get to see a glimpse of her from there through Genesis 23, where she dies at age 127. In the middle of her life is full of mountaintops moments where God protects her and fulfills promises to her, and we see her be foolish, selfish, and mean. Okay, so what does Sarah symbolize? Well, her name means princess, and she is the mother of the Jewish nation and considered the mother of faith. Sarah symbolizes freedom and God's favor, because it was her child rather than the son of Hagar, the slave woman, who fulfilled God's freely given promise, the one that God protected. We're moving on to our page 4, which is titled, God Sees You and He is Powerful Enough to Rescue You. One of the first things that happened after God speaks to Abram and they set out on this adventure of following God is a detour to Egypt. That is found in Genesis 12, where Abram is afraid and tells everyone that this beautiful woman is his sister, conveniently leaving off the part that they're married. Of course, she's immediately taken to the palace. God intervenes and rescues her in a clearly supernatural way. Can you imagine that? What a gift. That's one of the ways that God rescued Sarah from Egypt, because they took her. So this part is, so what happened here was that there was a famine. Okay, there was a famine in the area where Abram and Sarai were, and so they were forced to go to Egypt to be able to survive, because there was no food where they were at. And so Abram tells Sarah, we're going to lie. We're going to tell the Pharaoh that you're my sister because you're beautiful. He might want to take you as a wife. And if we tell him that we're married, he might want to kill me to take you. And so they do that. And sure enough, the Pharaoh takes her. She wants to take her as a wife. And the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues. And that made Pharaoh realize that she is Abraham's wife, and I'm being punished for taking the wife. It says here, the Pharaoh realized that Sarai was married to Abraham and confronted him. He then sent Sarai back to Abraham, giving them livestock, silver and gold, and told them to leave Egypt. Take your wife. I don't want it, because God is sending all these plagues. Now, these are not the plagues, the 10 plagues that God sent to Egypt to release the people from Israel. This is different. And so that we see this faithfulness of God, protecting Sarah and preserving that covenant that Abraham had with God. Because if they would have split, Sarah and Abraham would have split, they would have killed Abraham, then the father of many nations, like God called him, wouldn't exist. So there you go. God sees you, and he's powerful enough to rescue you. Okay, the next section says, God loves us even when. I don't know what your even when is, but know that God still loves you. He laid down his life for you, and he took it back up to prove that he was who he said he was and could do what he said he could do. For Sarah, after God rescued her from Egypt, a decade or so had passed, and she's still not had a child that God promised. So she gets antsy. She comes up with a plan to make things happen, because God told Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, and Sarah's not having any children. So when's that going to happen? So this is found in Genesis 16. Nobody bothers to consult God about this plan, not even Abram, and he listens to his wife. A lot of headache, a lot of heartache, and bloodshed could have been avoided, but no one stopped to ask God if he'd given Sarai the idea or not. But God still loved them and continued to bless them. And he'll continue to love you too. After all, we still love our kids even when, right? We may not like what they did, and it probably comes with consequences, but one of the ways we are like God is that we love our kids even when. So, Sarai told Abram to sleep with the slave woman, so that a child could come about, because that's the promise that God had sent to Abraham. But Sarah was not getting pregnant, so Sarah took it upon herself to make it happen, and he had her husband sleep with the servant girl, and indeed she had a child. So let's move on to the next section. Next section, and we like to do this. Don't blame God when he doesn't follow your plan. Now, Sarai's plan was to go to Abram and blame God for not giving them a child, which obviously means she needed to fix the situation herself. Insert eye roll here, right? I don't know. They say that men are the ones that want to fix an issue when you're venting to your husband, and they want to fix the issue for you. But here we see that Sarah is the one that's trying to, we can understand she's getting super old, and she's like, I'm gonna be not gonna be able to give you a kid if I don't hurry up and we make this happen. So she just wasn't getting pregnant, and so she had her plan of having her husband sleep with with Hagar. So she says to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." So she was planning on having her get pregnant and take her child. We need to be very careful when it comes to blaming God, because he sees the big picture and we don't. Because he knows what will happen if we go through this door or that one. Things don't work out the way Sarai hoped. Yes, Hagar got pregnant and had a son, but jealousy and contempt and mistreatment became a way of life in the camp. And those are not God's way. I don't know. I think as humans, possibly women too, I can speak for myself, you just get angsty and don't have any patience, and you just want things to happen quickly, And so I think that's what happened here to Sarai. Let's move on to page 6. You can't rush God. His timing is perfect. And we hear this all the time, and it's true. 14 years after Sarai's big plan. Here we're comparing it in Genesis 16 verse 16 with chapter 17 verse 1. God reconfirmed that the child he promised was specifically to be born of Sarai, who will now be called Sarah. Sarah laughed because by now she was nearly 90 years old, postmenopausal. This is in Genesis 18:11. Who wouldn't laugh? At that age and be told that you're going to have a child. Like, okay. What blows me away here is, in light of this fresh encounter with God and the events with Sodom and Gomorrah, where God spared Lot's family and destroyed everyone and everything in this area, Abraham immediately goes to another new location and passes Sarah off as his sister. So this time, Abraham moves the camp to an area where there's a king, and King Abimelech. And this area here, he lies again about Sarah and tells, the king that Sarah is his sister. That way he doesn't kill Abram. And the king indeed takes Sarah as a wife, situates her as a queen or the king's wife. And Abimelech has a dream. God appears in a dream to tell him that Sarah was married. And Abimelech had, wanted to protest his innocence, sends her away untouched and gives her back to Abraham. Okay, so God rescues Sarah again a second time from a king. The Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised to Sarah. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. And at the very time God had promised him, God did what he promised at the very time God had promised. The appointed time. That was his appointed time. Maybe he was waiting for Sarah to be 90 years old. Because he glorifies himself because it's something impossible that only God can do. So when it could only have been God's handiwork, just like he did with Mary centuries later. An impossible supernatural pregnancy thing happened here, and Mary had gotten pregnant through the Holy Spirit, right? Okay, so just like he does for us, it may not be miraculous birth, but he shows up on time every time. It's hard when we want it now, whatever it is, but he's trustworthy and faithful. Ask Sarah. Sit with her for a while. See what she has to say. Moving on to page 7. Even shaky faith is powerful. Sarah's faith wavered. And I think that happens to all of us. It shook several times. There's no denying that. There was a time when Lot, the nephew, abandoned them and took the better land. Remember, they got into a fight, Abraham and him, and Abraham gave his nephew the better land, and he took the one that's not so good. That's in Genesis 13 and 14. The orphan nephew that they had taken in was now fighting with his uncle. And Sarah saw that and it's like, how could that be? How could that happen? Like, why does God allow that? You know, like her faith probably wavered at that point. The times that Abraham used her to protect himself, you know, claiming only that they were brother and sister, she probably felt kind of betrayed by Abraham or used. So I can see how she felt that way, and probably her faith wavered at that time. The time she completely gave up on any hope of having her own son and offered her slave to Abram as the brilliant solution to all their problems. Her faith probably wavered then, because it made her take matters into her own hands. And in between all that, she had her mountain tops, where God rescued her from Egypt and from Abimelech. When God gave her Isaac, and that should have been impossible. But the thing to remember is she had faith in God. It wasn't always strong, but it was real. When God went so far as to make sure we never forget her faith. God went so far as to make sure we never forget her faith. He placed Sarah in the Hebrew Hall of Faith. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. Yes, she laughed when she heard the promise, but even so, she knew he was faithful and could do it. She laughed, but she didn't doubt. It's hard to say, because you could say, well, she laughed because she doubted. She didn't doubt. Possibly she heard the promise, she laughed, she might have doubted, but I think she regained her faith and saying, because she kept believing, when is this child going to come? When is this child going to come? She kept believing for that promise. So I hope some of these lessons from Sarah in the Bible resonated with you today. I hope you'll take some time to read Genesis 11. Think about what Sarah has to say to you. What we can learn from this woman who wandered all over the promised land with her husband and their tribe was large enough to have its own army. I am thankful to be able to read of others in their mistakes and successes, blunders, defiance, reconciliation, and forgiveness. It strengthens my faith. It reminds me of what I've already learned, and it helps me remember that above all, God's got it. And I can trust him even when I don't see how it is possible. I think also what we can learn from Sarah is how close she was to her husband. You know, she never gave bad advice to him about not listening to God because the promise wasn't coming fast enough. She never intervened with Abraham in God's relationship, and she was obedient. Wherever Abraham said to go, she would go. Even after he told the kings that it was just her sister or his sister, you know, she didn't rebel against that. She might have felt hurt, but she kept to staying with him. So that's as a wife, I think we have a lot to learn from Sarah. We stick through good times and bad times with our husbands. And that is hard to do, because when we are in a bad position, in a fight, or in our lows with our marriage, the enemy sweeps in to give you advice. And we're at a very weak point that the enemy could be successful. But we thank God that he is faithful, and he has given us the strength to continue our marriage and to continue strong in faith. And I think that Sarah was like that. I think Sarah kept her faith and took her to a position where she continued her entire 90 years, and God fulfilled that promise with her. So thank you so much for staying with me through this Bible study, small, short Bible study of women of the Bible. And we'll see you next week with somebody else. I don't know who I'm going to be talking about, but for sure stay tuned, and I'll give an update on who's next week. Okay, see ya. Bye.